He's probably lost. Somebody find out if he came in on the tour bus and get him back to it before he wanders into the bay. Whitney Ashcroft said it without lowering her tablet, without breaking the rhythm of her briefing, the way a person swats at a fly mid-sentence and expects the room to keep moving. 6 members of the Cotter County Museum Board sat around the folding table in front of her, and behind them, through the propped bay doors, stood a man in a rust-colored barn coat who had not moved in 11 minutes. He was not lost. He would return to that same 6 feet of concrete every afternoon for 4 more days running, at the same hour, never once asking to come closer to the tank. And nobody in that room yet knew enough to ask why. As I was saying, Whitney tapped the tablet twice, the gesture she used before delivering anything unwelcome, like she was daring the numbers to change their mind before she said them aloud. We are 6 days in and $20,000 in, and the number 4 cylinder is still refusing to fire. The block shows a hairline stress fracture, consistent with a manufacturing flaw from the original foundry run. That is not something duct tape and elbow grease fixes. That is something you engineer around, and engineering around it costs money the county does not currently have. Sloan Hackney, the board secretary, glanced toward the doors. And him? Comes in around this time most days, stands there, leaves before we lock up. Harmless. Probably misses the war movies they used to show at the old drive-in, and this is as close as he gets. A ripple of polite laughter went around the table, the kind that costs nothing and means less. Whitney didn't laugh. She was too busy scrolling to the next slide, a rendering of the museum's founding day ceremony, red ribbon looped across the tank's glacis plate. Garland Winslow, founding director emeritus, printed beneath a photograph of a silver-haired man in a blazer. If you've ever been counted out by the very thing you built, type steady in the comments. The old man's name was Orville Colvin, 79 years old, and he had spent 3 years of his life with his hands inside that exact engine, back when it ran on gravel roads instead of concrete, back when the paint on its hull was still the color the Army had ordered, rather than the color 40 years of weather had bargained it down to. He wore a cap bleached the color of old hay by 3 decades of summer light, canvas trousers gone soft at the knee, and in the left pocket of that barn coat, folded twice and bound with a rubber band gone brittle at the edges, was a canvas maintenance log stamped with a 5-digit hull number he had not needed to check in 55 years because he had never once forgotten it. His left hand carried a tremor, small and constant, the kind that made the coffee cup rattle faintly against its saucer at the diner counter each morning. It was the kind of tremor a stranger's eye catches and files under frailty, under something to be managed, something to be spoken past rather than to. Whitney Ashcroft did not look at his hands. She did not look at him again at all that afternoon. She had a fracture to explain to a board that wanted a working monument by Saturday noon, and a man in a barn coat, however long he stood there, did not appear anywhere on her clipboard, her contract, or her mind. Orville turned and walked back out into the October light without a word, the way he had walked in, and nobody in that room thought to ask where a man goes who comes to a doorway every day and never once steps through it. He came back the next afternoon at 4 o'clock exactly, the way he had every day that week, and would every day after, until the day the question of why finally cracked open on its own. By then the museum staff had stopped noticing him the way you stop noticing a fence post at the edge of a familiar field. He would come through the side gate off the gravel lot, cross the yard past the flagpole and the bronze plaque commemorating the county's founding, and stand at the same spot inside the bay doors, not one step closer, not one step farther, with his cap in one hand and his eyes on the tank the way another man might look at a grown child he hadn't seen in decades. The barn coat had been rust-colored once. Now it was the color of things that have outlasted their own color, soft at the seams, patched twice at the left elbow with a canvas that didn't quite match. He kept his hands folded in front of him, and when the tremor came, always in the left, always small, a flutter like a moth against glass. It would still the moment his palm found something solid to rest against. The door frame, his own knee, once, briefly, the cool skin of the tank's front slope plate. On the second day, when nobody was looking his direction, and he allowed himself 3 seconds of contact before folding his hands again and stepping back to his line. In the right pocket of the coat, worn soft from being carried rather than read, was the folded canvas log. He never took it out in front of anyone. He knew what was written on its cover, a 5-digit whole number, stamped in ink on the color of strong tea, the way another man knows his own birthday without needing to check it. And there was some comfort in that, in owning a fact so completely it no longer required proof. He hummed while he watched. Low, almost under the register of hearing, the kind of tune a man produces without meaning to, worn smooth from years of repetition. It was 4 notes repeating, then a 5th that lifted before it settled. Lottie had hummed it every August of their married life, elbow deep in canning jars, the kitchen thick with the smell of tomatoes going soft in boiling water. And somewhere in the 41 years since he'd first heard her hum it, he had absorbed the tune the way a plank absorbs the grain of the tree it once was. She had been gone 6 years now. The hymn had stayed. He did not know all of its words anymore. He knew the shape of it, the rise and fall, and some afternoons, that was enough. Humming it under his breath while 3 young mechanics in county polo shirts argued over torque specifications 20 feet away, none of them aware that the sound drifting toward them from the doorway was a woman's voice, borrowed 40 years and still being paid forward. Austin Tatum noticed the humming before he noticed anything else about the old man. 24 years old, 3 months into the restoration job, the kind of quiet that comes from being new enough to still be listening rather than talking, Austin had clocked the tune on the 4th afternoon and thought, without knowing why, that it sounded like something out of a hymnal rather than a radio. He didn't ask about it. He filed it away the way you file away a smell that reminds you of somewhere you can't quite place. What Austin did ask about, quietly, to nobody in particular, was why the old man never came any closer than the doorway. 3 months of watching people move through that bay, tour groups, donors, board members eager to touch history with their own palms, had taught him that everybody wanted to get closer to the tank. Everybody except this one, who stood at the same 6 feet of concrete like there was a line painted there only he could see, and who left every evening at the same hour without having asked a single question. Once, on the 3rd day, Whitney Ashcroft's assistant offered him a folding chair. Orville shook his head, small and polite, the cap turning once in his hands. "Obliged," he said, "but I don't stay that long." Then he watched another 40 minutes standing, said nothing further, and left before the crew locked the roll-up door behind him. He always left with the same motion, a nod to no one in particular, a settling of the cap back onto his head, and the log in his pocket pressed flat against his hip as he walked. The way a man carries something he has carried so long that its weight has become indistinguishable from his own. Nobody asked him his name that week. Nobody asked him much of anything. He had the particular invisibility of a man whose clothes announce poverty before his face announces anything else. And the museum bay was full of people trained to read spec sheets, not men. By the 6th day, the crew had stopped joking that a stranger was watching them work, mostly because they had stopped joking about much of anything. $20,000 and 6 days into a project with a Saturday deadline bearing down on it. Humor had gone the way patience usually goes under pressure, thin and then thinner, and then replaced by something with an edge to it. "Deader than the old man in the doorway," said one of the crew, a broad-shouldered technician named Reed, wiping grease off a socket wrench and nodding toward Orville without quite looking at him. "At least he shows up on time. Engine won't even do that much." A few of them laughed, tired laughter, more relief than humor, the kind that comes from 6 days of failure needing somewhere to go. Whitney allowed herself the ghost of a smile without looking up from her tablet, where she was drafting the language for a report she did not want to write. Manufacturing defect determination, block replacement recommended, cost estimate to follow. "He's not wrong," she said. "This thing has been dead longer than some of you have been alive. We've run compression tests. We've bench tested the injector pump twice. We've had the fuel system pressure checked by 2 separate contractors, and every reading says the same thing. There's a fracture in that block old enough to vote." She tapped the tablet twice. "I don't love saying it, But sometimes the museum piece is just a museum piece. Some things don't run again. They just get looked at. Orville, from his spot by the doors, said nothing. His eyes moved from the tablet in her hand to the fuel line running along the underside of the engine deck. A replacement section, newer than the rest, the fittings a slightly different gauge than the original run. He had noticed it on the first day. He had said nothing about it then either. It was Austin who caught the correction. 3 words, spoken almost too quiet to reach across the bay. Reed had been describing the injector pump's failure mode to a museum volunteer, calling it original equipment, when Orville, not raising his voice, not stepping forward, barely turning his head, said, "That fitting's not." Reed frowned. "Not what?" "Not original." Orville nodded, once, toward the underside of the engine. "Wrong thread pitch for the year. Somebody swapped that line a good while back." Reed opened his mouth to argue, and then didn't, because when he crouched down to look, the fitting was, in fact, wrong. A slightly different profile than the ones flanking it. A replacement part doing an original part's job, and doing it badly. He straightened up slower than he'd crouched down, glanced at Whitney, and said nothing more, because there wasn't an obvious way to make a joke out of being right by accident. Whitney glanced over too, just once, filed it under coincidence, and went back to her report. But Austin Tatum kept looking at the old man in the doorway a beat longer than he had the day before. The way you look twice at a word you suddenly aren't sure how to spell. He didn't say anything about it that day. He just started paying attention. The way a person starts checking a weather report once they've noticed the sky doing something it isn't supposed to do. The ignition attempts began the next morning, 3 of them across 2 hours, and Orville watched every one of them from his spot without shifting his weight, without speaking, his hands folded and still except for that faint tremor that came and went in the left like a moth testing a window. The first attempt was procedure exactly as the manual specified. Battery bank engaged, primer bulb worked by hand, ignition sequence run through its full cycle while Whitney called out voltages to Austin, who logged them onto a tablet clipped to a stand beside the engine deck. The starter turned. The engine groaned, caught for half a second on something that sounded almost like combustion, then died. Reed swore under his breath. Whitney tapped her own tablet twice, unbothered, professional, the way a surgeon logs a complication rather than a failure. "Fuel delivery's inconsistent," she said. "Line pressure's dropping somewhere between the tank and the pump. We bled it twice yesterday. We'll bleed it again." The second attempt, 40 minutes later, added a fresh fuel filter and another full bleed of the line. Every fitting checked and rechecked by hand. The starter turned longer this time. The engine caught twice, stuttered, and died again. This time with a knock that made 2 of the younger technicians step back from the engine deck without being told to. Orville's lips moved during that one. Not words exactly. Nobody standing near enough to notice could have said for certain. But a small, private motion. The shape of a sequence. 4 positions and a pause. The kind of thing a man's mouth does when his hands used to do it so many times the body kept the memory somewhere past language. Austin caught it from across the bay, the way you catch someone counting silently to themselves, and didn't understand it, but didn't forget it either. The third attempt came just after 2 in the afternoon, with Whitney herself at the primer bulb this time, sleeves pushed to her elbows, her jaw set the particular way of someone who has decided that the next failure will not be allowed to be a failure of technique. The starter turned. The engine caught, ran rough for nearly 4 full seconds, long enough for someone near the doors to start a hopeful clap that died halfway through its own sound, and then choked out entirely, leaving behind a silence thick enough to hear the ticking of the cooling metal. Nobody joked this time. Whitney stood with her hands still on the primer bulb, staring at the engine deck the way a person stares at a math problem that has produced the same wrong answer 3 separate times using 3 separate methods. The museum board convened in the office trailer an hour later, and the conversation that came out of it reached the bay before the board members did, the way bad news always travels faster than the people carrying it. Sloane Hackney delivered it to Whitney directly, her voice flat with the particular fatigue of someone who has just watched a budget meeting go nowhere good. "They're pulling the plug on the in-house repair," Sloan said. "Contract's already drawn up with Lockhart Heritage Motorworks for a full teardown. Truck comes Monday morning, 7 o'clock, whether it's running by then or not. They want it either fixed for Saturday or hauled off Monday, so it's not sitting here half-finished during the ceremony." Whitney nodded slowly, the number landing on her the way numbers always did, concrete and final. 6 days, $20,000. 2 days left before a truck came to take the problem somewhere else, and a ribbon cutting on Saturday that would now have to happen around a tank that either ran or didn't, with no room left for a third option. She looked toward the bay doors out of habit more than curiosity, and there was the old man again, exactly where he always stood, exactly on time, his cap in his hands, watching the cooling engine with an expression that wasn't hope and wasn't sorrow, but something quieter than both. Something that had been waiting so long it no longer needed to announce itself. It was Reed, worn down by 3 failures and a deadline that had just gotten teeth, who said it half as a joke and half as something closer to surrender. "Hey, old-timer." He didn't turn all the way around. "You've been standing there all week like you know something we don't. Anything you want to share with the class?" A few of the crew laughed, tired laughter again, the kind used to fill a silence rather than mock anyone in particular. Whitney didn't laugh this time. She was watching Orville now, really watching him, for the first time all week, the way you watch something only once you've run out of other places to look. Orville was quiet long enough that Reed nearly turned back to the engine, assuming the silence was its own answer. Then Orville stepped forward. 1 step, no more. The first step past his 6 feet of concrete all week, and reached into his coat pocket, not for the log, but for the faded blue bandana folded there beside it. "I'd need to feel it," he said. "Not look at it. Feel it." He held the bandana up, an offer and a question both. "You mind?" Whitney's mouth opened on the beginning of a laugh that didn't quite arrive. Something in the way he'd said it, plain, unhurried, entirely without theater, took the humor out of the moment before it could form. She looked at Austin, who was already nodding slightly, without knowing why he was nodding, only that something in him wanted to see this through. "Knock yourself out," Whitney said, and the words came out thinner than she meant them to. Orville tied the bandana over his eyes himself, not at the back, the way a man ties something he's tied 1,000 times before. Then he crossed the bay, unhurried, one hand trailing along the fender to find his bearing, the tremor in his left hand gone still the instant his palm touched steel, and knelt beside the engine deck where the fuel line ran its crooked, mismatched course beneath the manifold. His fingers moved along the line, the way a man reads a name carved into a headstone he's visited for years, past the filter housing, along a coupling, down to a valve tucked behind the pump body, one that none of the crew's 3 days of diagnostics had flagged as anything but incidental. "Sticking," he said, quiet, mostly to himself. "Feels froze up. Not broke, froze." He worked it with his thumb and 2 fingers, small motions, patient, the kind of patience that doesn't announce itself as patience because it has never known another speed. Somebody in the bay checked a watch without meaning to. 40 seconds. A minute. Whitney's arms were crossed so tight her knuckles had gone pale. "There," Orville said, so softly it barely carried. Something in the valve gave, a small mechanical yield audible only in the stillness the whole bay had fallen into without agreeing to. Now the primer, slow. 3 pumps, no more. Austin worked the primer bolt himself, 3 slow pumps, his hands not quite steady. Orville's fingers moved to the ignition relay, found it by memory rather than sight, and his lips began moving again. The same silent sequence Austin had caught 2 days before, except now it wasn't silent at all. Choke half, throttle quarter, prime, wait on it. A pause, no longer than a held breath. Now. The starter turned, the engine caught. Not the half-second stutter of the morning's failures, but a real catch, low and rising, the sound of something remembering itself. It ran rough for 1 second, 2, and then settled, the note dropping into a steady, thudding idle that filled the bay with a sound none of them had heard the tank make in 6 days of trying. Nobody clapped, nobody spoke. The engine's own voice was the only sound in that whole cavernous space, and for 8 seconds, 10, 12, the entire crew stood exactly where they'd been standing when it started, as though moving might undo it. Orville reached up and untied the bandana himself, blinking in the shop light, his hand finding the fender for balance the way a man steadies himself after standing too long. He did not smile. He looked at the engine the way a person looks at someone they have missed for a very long time and are only now allowed to see again. 2 minutes, Austin said, staring at the timer still running on the tablet clipped to its stand. His voice had gone strange in his own ears. 1 minute 50. He did that in 1 minute 50. Whitney Ashcroft said nothing at all. She was looking at the fuel valve Orville's fingers had found without sight, the one her own diagnostics, her own contractors, her own $20,000 of testing had passed over 3 separate times, and for the first time in 6 days, she had no number ready to explain it. The quiet didn't last. It rarely does once paperwork gets involved. Sloane Hackney was the one who said it. Gently, almost apologetically, an hour later in the museum office, the engine's idle still faintly audible through the wall, like a held note nobody wanted to let go of. "I believe you," she told Orville, and meant it. She'd seen his hands find that valve blind. She wasn't questioning the truth of what her own eyes had shown her. "But the roster plaque on that hull lists a crew chief, and the name on it isn't Colvin. It's been that way since the tank came to us. I need to understand why before I can put your name anywhere near this vehicle's history." She turned a laptop toward him, a photograph of the bronze plaque bolted low on the tank's hull, weathered green with age, 5 names cast into it beneath a hull number that matched, precisely, the one stamped on the cover of the canvas log still folded in Orville's coat pocket. 5 names, not 6. And the one listed as crew chief was not his. Orville looked at the screen for a long moment, his jaw working slightly, the tremor returning to his left hand now that there was no metal for it to rest against. "That's not right," he said, quiet, no anger in it, only the flat certainty of a man correcting a fact rather than defending himself. "I was chief on that hull 3 years, 66 to 69. There ought to be 6 names, not 5, and mine ought to be first among them." "I don't doubt what your hands just did in that bay," Sloane said carefully. "But I've got a plaque, a museum record, and a donor file that all agree with each other and don't agree with you. I need something that isn't just—" She paused, searching for a kinder way to say it, and didn't find one. "Isn't just your say-so." Orville's hand went to his coat pocket, hesitated, and did not come out with the log, not yet. Some things, once shown, cannot be unshown, and he had carried that log 55 years without needing anyone else's belief to make it true. He wasn't ready to spend it on a room that had only just stopped laughing at him. It was the board chair, a heavyset man named Prentice, who'd said little all afternoon, who delivered the second blow, almost offhand, the way a man mentions a scheduling conflict without registering it as a wound. "There's another wrinkle," he said. "Saturday's ceremony. Garland Winslow is cutting the ribbon. Founding director for 18 years. The man who acquired half this collection, including that tank. It was his years of work that got that hole donated to this county in the first place. If we're about to say the record he built is wrong 2 days before we put him in front of a camera thanking him for it—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Whitney, standing near the window with her arms crossed, had gone very quiet. She was thinking about her own report, the one she still hadn't finished, the one that currently attributed the fault to a manufacturing flaw in the block. A conclusion her instruments had supported completely, and which, she now understood with a discomfort she didn't have a name for yet, might simply be the wrong question asked very precisely. "The fuel line," she said, half to herself. "That fitting reed flagged. Wrong thread pitch for the year." She looked at Orville. "You knew that the first day, before any of us ran a single test." Orville nodded once. "Wasn't there when I turned that engine last. Somebody put it in after." "After what?" "After me," he said, and the plainness of it was almost worse than an accusation would have been. The bay outside had gone quiet, with the engine shut back down for the night, and through the window, the tank sat dark and patient in the fading October light. Its bronze plaque catching the last of the sun, 5 names and a whole number that agreed with each other, and did not agree with the man who had just made it run. Sloane closed the laptop gently, the photograph of the plaque disappearing from the screen. "I'm not calling you a liar, Mr. Colvin," she said. "I'm telling you that belief and a museum record are 2 different things, and Saturday is 2 days away." Orville stood, settled his cap back onto his head, and said nothing further, though his hand found the log in his pocket one more time on his way out the door, checking the way a man checks a pulse. Austin Tatum found the number for Homer Red in the County Veterans Hall directory that same evening, dialing it from the museum office phone with Sloane's reluctant permission and a nervousness he didn't fully understand, given that he'd known the man's name for exactly 4 hours. "He said something about a co-signed log," Austin explained, when Homer's voice, gravel-worn but steady, answered on the 3rd ring. "Orville Colvin. He's got a maintenance log with a hull number on it, but the plaque on the tank here doesn't list his name, and the board's not sure what to believe 2 days before a ceremony." There was a silence on the line long enough that Austin thought the call had dropped. Then Homer Red said, "Give me the address," in a voice that had already made up its mind. He arrived at the museum bay the next morning at 9 o'clock sharp, 81 years old, moving with the particular economy of a man who had spent a career learning not to waste motion, a canvas satchel under one arm. He crossed the yard without pausing at the flagpole, without glancing at the plaque out front, and went straight to Orville, who was standing in his usual spot, though it was hours before his usual 4 o'clock. Homer didn't offer a handshake first. He came to something close to attention instead, an old habit surfacing before conscious thought could stop it, and said, "Chief," with a crack in the word that hadn't been there in the 4 hours of memory Austin had of this man's voice on the phone. Whitney, watching from beside the engine deck, felt something shift in the room's temperature before either man had said another word. "Sergeant Major," Orville answered, and that was all. For a moment. 2 old soldiers looking at each other across a bay full of people who had, until that instant, understood almost nothing about either of them. Homer opened the satchel and drew out a log of his own, older even than the one in Orville's pocket, its canvas gone nearly black with age, and set it on the workbench beside Whitney's tablet. "I co-signed the maintenance record on this hull in the spring of '69, he said, to the room now, not just to Orville. "Every fuel system modification, every engine swap, every part substitution on this vehicle for 3 years has my signature next to Orville Colvin's, because that was the regulation. 2 signatures, chief and NCO witness, or the paperwork didn't count." He turned to a page near the back, the ink faded but legible, and set his finger beside a name. "Colvin, crew chief, right there, same hull number as your plaque." Sloane Hackney, who had come out to the bay at the sound of raised voices that weren't actually raised, leaned in to look, and her face went very still. The particular stillness of someone recognizing a name a half-second before the rest of the room catches up. "Then why isn't it on the plaque?" she said, quiet. It was Whitney who answered, because she'd spent the previous night with the acquisition file open on her laptop until 2 in the morning, chasing a discomfort she couldn't yet name. "Because the plaque wasn't cast from these logs," she said. "It was cast from a museum intake form, filed 22 years ago." She turned her tablet around. On the screen was a scanned acquisitions record, and at the bottom of it, a signature. G. Winslow, Acquisitions Clerk. Garland Winslow filed this hull's original paperwork before he was ever director, Whitney went on, her voice slower now, working it out as she spoke it. The maintenance history that came with the donation was incomplete. A page was missing, the one that would have shown a mid-service fuel line substitution, a cheaper part swapped in to save a repair bill. Whoever filed it that year had 2 choices: track down the missing page and explain the substitution to whoever was footing the bill back then, or just leave a name off a form nobody was going to check for 22 years. Homer Red's jaw tightened. "That fuel line," he said, looking now at Orville. "That's the one you fixed yesterday." "Never should have needed fixing," Orville said. "It was fine when I turned that engine last, in '69. Whoever put a cheap line in after that is the reason your machines couldn't find the fault. They were testing what's there. Nobody built a test for what somebody took out." The bay had gone silent except for the tick of the cooling engine and, somewhere outside, a truck idling in the gravel lot. The Lockhart Heritage Motorworks flatbed arrived a day early to stage for Monday's tow. Whitney looked at her tablet, at the diagnostic conclusion she'd drafted 6 days ago and had not yet had the courage to delete, and said, mostly to herself, it was never the block. "No," Orville said, not unkindly. "It was a line somebody swapped to save a little money, filed under a mistake somebody else made to cover for it. Your instruments read the fault fine. They just couldn't read the reason." Sloane Hackney was still looking at the acquisitions form on Whitney's screen, at the signature at the bottom of it, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost every trace of the careful, apologetic tone from the day before. "Garland Winslow is standing at that podium in 2 days," she said, "cutting a ribbon on a history he wrote himself into and wrote another man out of." Nobody in the bay said anything for a long moment. Outside, the flatbed truck's engine shut off, and in the sudden quiet, Orville Colvin reached into his coat pocket and for the first time in 4 days of visits, drew out the folded canvas log and set it gently on the workbench beside Homer's. 2 logs, side by side, same whole numbers stamped on both covers, 55 years of dust between them and not one letter of disagreement. The board met that same afternoon, and this time Orville was asked to sit, and this time he did. "We'd like your name on the plaque," Prentice said, sliding a printed mock-up across the table. "Orville Colvin, crew chief, in place of the name that had stood there 22 years. Cast fresh, ready by Saturday. We can have it done." Orville looked at the mock-up for a long moment, his thumb resting against the edge of the paper, and then slid it back an inch, not rejecting it, just setting it down between them the way a man sets down a tool he isn't ready to pick up yet. "I didn't come back for the engine," he said, and the room went as still as the bay had gone the moment the ignition caught. "I came back because nobody left to remember it was mine. Wasn't only mine, though. There were 5 other men on that hull with me. Loader, gunner, driver, 2 more crew that rotated through when we lost men to transfer. Their names ought to be on there before mine gets fussed over. I've had 55 years to think about what I'd want said if anybody ever asked, and it was never just my name I wanted said." He looked at Homer, who nodded once, already knowing the 5 names Orville was about to give, because his own log had them too, faded but legible, co-signed in the spring of 1969 by 2 men who had trusted each other with paperwork the way they'd trusted each other with everything else. "Give me a minute," Whitney said, and it wasn't a request so much as a decision already made. She pulled her tablet toward her, opened the diagnostic report she had never quite finished, and, in front of the whole board, began typing over her own conclusion. Root cause: aftermarket fuel line substitution. Installation date unconfirmed, likely concurrent with 2003 acquisition intake. Original fault correctly diagnosed in the field, 1969, by Crew Chief Orville Colvin, using a hand bleed sequence not documented in factory manuals. She read it back once, aloud, her voice steadier than it had been in 6 days, and did not apologize for the 6 days it had taken her to write it, because Orville hadn't asked her to. Garland Winslow came to the museum office at Sloane's call late that afternoon, silver-haired and composed, expecting, by the tone of the message, some ceremonial courtesy ahead of Saturday. What he found instead was 2 open logs on the table, a diagnostic report rewritten in front of him, and Orville Colvin sitting quietly with his cap in his lap. He looked at the logs for a long time before he spoke. "I was 36, he said finally, to no one and everyone. The line was going to cost more to trace properly than the county had budgeted that quarter, and I was 3 months into the job and didn't want my first acquisition to come with a repair bill nobody could explain. I filed it clean. I told myself it didn't matter which 5 names were on a plaque nobody read closely. He looked up, and there was no defiance in his face, only the tired stillness of a man setting down something heavy he'd carried without admitting its weight. It mattered to somebody, I see that now. Nobody in the room said the word wrong. Nobody needed to. Orville only nodded, once, the way a man accepts an apology he was never owed personally, but had waited a long time to hear given to somebody. "Cut your ribbon Saturday," Orville said. "Man built this place near 20 years. That's not nothing. Just let the plaque say true from here on." Saturday arrived cool and bright, the kind of October morning that makes the grass silver with dew until nearly 10 o'clock. And by noon, the museum yard was full of folding chairs and a crowd larger than Mercer Hollow's population usually produced for anything but the county fair. The tank sat gleaming under a fresh coat of hand-rubbed wax, engine idling low and steady for the first time in a public setting, and beside it stood a draped bronze plaque on an easel, waiting. Garland Winslow gave his remarks first, shorter than anyone expected, and near the end of them he said, plainly, without excuse-making, "This museum's history is only as good as its honesty, and I owe a correction to a family of names that should have stood here 22 years sooner." Then he stepped back, and Sloan Hackney pulled the drape. 6 names. Orville Colvin, crew chief, first among them. And beside his, the 5 men who had rotated through that whole crew across 3 years of gravel roads and desert heat, restored to bronze, the way Homer Red's log had always kept them, patient and unread, for 55 years. Hunter Pruitt, the county paper's stringer, stepped back from his notepad without quite meaning to, when Orville, asked by a reporter what the tank's old radio call sign had been, answered it quietly, and the word landed in the crowd the way a struck bell lands in a quiet room. Not loud, but impossible to unhear. Whitney Ashcroft stood near the front of the crowd, her tablet left in the truck for once, and when Orville passed her on his way back to his truck afterward, she said only, "Thank you," and he answered, "You'd have found it eventually. Machines are honest. They just needed the right question." And that was the whole of it. No speech, no less.